Would you believe a dog survived 17 days, locked inside a steel box, without food, without water, surrounded by nothing but rusted walls and silence? Somewhere in the heart of the bustling port of Charleston, South Carolina, with cranes creaking in the wind and cargo ships docking every hour, a routine customs check was about to uncover something that would bring grown workers to tears and rewrite everything people believed about canine survival and loyalty. And while you watch this story unfolds, we'd love to know where you're watching from and what time is it over there right now. Drop it in the comments, because this story is going to stay with you long after the screen fades to black, and you may want to talk about it too. It all began on a Friday morning that started like any other, just past 6:45 a.m. as the first round of container offloads began at the eastern dock, with orange-vested workers shouting over the hum of diesel engines, forklifts clanking over the concrete yard, and radios buzzing with updates about load positions. But as the sun casts its golden hue over a row of gray containers from Southeast Asia, something unusual caught the eye of a seasoned worker named Tom Hale, a 58-year-old supervisor known for his sharp instincts and quieter demeanor, a man who had worked the docks for over 30 years and trusted his gut more than any clipboard or manifest. And on this particular morning, as he reviewed an aging container manifest marked miscellaneous tools, he noticed the serial number didn't match its expected arrival schedule. A small discrepancy most would ignore, but Tom didn't, because something about this container felt off. Not because of its rusty latches or the faint dent on its side, but because, as he later described, it felt like it was hiding something that didn't want to be found. The container had arrived 2 weeks earlier during a storm delay and had been mistakenly shuffled behind larger loads, where it sat uninspected, untouched, and unnoticed. And when Tom ordered it to be opened, the two junior workers who pried the lock loose weren't expecting anything but maybe faulty equipment or expired goods. Certainly not what they found instead, because the moment the heavy door creaked open, before any words were spoken, before they even saw clearly, they smelled it, the sharp, stale air of metal and something alive, mixed with something that hadn't eaten, hadn't moved, hadn't belonged there. At first, all they saw was darkness, the way sunlight stops just short of illuminating a sealed box. But then, as their eyes adjusted, a faint pair of golden eyes stared back, not wide with fear, but with a quiet, exhausted acceptance, like they had been waiting for days for someone to notice. A German shepherd, thin as rails, fur matted with dust and oil, emerged from the shadows, not barking, not crying, just crawling slowly toward the edge of the door, his paws hesitant on the cold steel floor, his head tilted slightly to the side as if unsure whether this was real. And in that moment, time on the dockyard seemed to stop. Tom dropped his clipboard and stepped forward without hesitation, whispering, "Easy, boy," as if the dog could understand every word. And somehow, the dog did, because he didn't flinch, didn't retreat. He just sat down gently at the edge of the container, the metal bowl beside him long empty, a piece of torn tarp barely cushioning his frail frame. And Tom kneeled without thinking, extending his hand, while the workers behind him froze in awe, unsure whether they were witnessing a rescue or a miracle. For 17 days, as confirmed later by international shipping logs, the container had been sealed, airtight, sun-beaten, with internal temperatures that rose past 100 degrees, and no listed food or water source inside. And yet, this dog, whom they would later name Harbor, had survived, and no one yet knew how. But as Tom carried the frail shepherd into the emergency vet van that had been summoned in a panic, he couldn't stop shaking his head, repeating under his breath, 17 days, and he waited, ... like he knew we'd come. What none of them could understand then, not even Tom, was that this was no accident. And the container was never meant to carry life, but Harbor had ended up in it for a reason that would unravel slowly, painfully and beautifully over the next few weeks. He wasn't just lost, he was returning. And the story of how he got into that container and who he was before it would break and heal hearts across the country. But for now, as he lay silently on the vet's table, breathing shallowly but alive, Harbor became more than a stray. dog? He became a mystery, a symbol, and for Tom Hale, something deeply personal, something connected to a story he had buried for decades. Long before shipping manifests and dock inspections ever became his life, and that's where this story begins, with a dog who waited in silence and a man who chose not to look away. The vet on duty that day, Dr. Emily Carver, had seen a lot in her 15 years of working trauma cases: dogs hit by cars, animals abandoned in trash bags, even a parrot once duct-taped inside a suitcase. But the moment Harbor was wheeled into her clinic wrapped in an oil-stained safety vest, his body trembling from dehydration, his eyes still wide and eerily calm, she knew this was different, because this wasn't just an accident. This was survival beyond logic, and it forced her, just like it did Tom, to lean into instinct more than medicine, to treat him not just like a patient but like something sacred. And as she laid him gently onto the exam table, calling softly to keep him awake, her hands running across his fragile ribs, she noticed the little details that told a bigger story: the way his paws were worn down unevenly, suggesting he had been pacing back and forth inside the container, the cracked skin at the edge of his snout where he'd likely tried to dig or nudge something open, and worst of all, the pink hue in his urine that hinted at kidney damage from going too long without water. And yet, despite everything, despite the unimaginable heat, the noise of ships, the suffocating, Dark Harbor hadn't just survived, he had endured. And even in his weakened state, as Emily's team inserted the 4 and draped cooling cloths over his back, he didn't whine, didn't struggle, didn't flinch. He just looked at her, steady and patient, like he had more to tell, like he was waiting again. But this time, not for rescue, for recognition. Later, when Emily called Tom to update him, her voice cracked without warning, and she confessed something she hadn't told anyone: that when Harbor first blinked up at her and his paw shifted against her palm, it reminded her of her old dog, Samson, who had passed away 3 winters ago. And for a split second, she had felt like she was being forgiven for not being able to save him in the end. And Tom, listening from the port office, where he'd returned to gather his thoughts, understood completely, because Harbor was doing something rare, something only a few dogs do in a lifetime. He wasn't just surviving. He was making people feel seen, and it made Tom wonder again what this dog had been through, and more importantly, why. By the next morning, Harbor was stable enough to lift his head, and when a young vet tech named Jordan sat beside his crate with a bowl of ice chips, the dog leaned forward slowly, his tongue dry but deliberate, and began to lick them one by one, almost with reverence. And Jordan, barely 20, sat there with tears in his eyes, whispering, "You're a miracle, buddy," over and over. And it was in that quiet moment, with soft jazz playing on the clinic radio and sunlight warming the tiled floor, that Harbor made his first sound since the container: a low, muffled whine, not of pain, but connection. And Jordan smiled so wide it hurt, because in that instant, he didn't see a rescue case. He saw a soul coming back to life. News of the dog found in the container had already begun to spread across the dockyard, and soon to the local community, where word of mouths traveled faster than formal reports. And by noon, Harbor had become the subject of 1,000 whispered questions: who put him in there? Someone trying to smuggle him? Could he have climbed in by accident? But the truth, as it always does, was more complicated. And it began to unravel that same day when a port records manager named Amy pulled Tom aside with a look of quiet urgency, holding an old clipboard with shipping logs from 3 weeks prior. And on that log, next to the serial number of the no-infamous container, was a handwritten note that had been missed in the digitization process: a single line that read, "Delayed transfer from Tally Ridge, rerouted from Yard B." Tom blinked at it for a long time, confused, because Tally Ridge was a small industrial district nearly 200 miles inland, and there had been no reason for a container from there to be mixed in with international cargo unless someone had moved it intentionally. And suddenly, the questions began to multiply. And so did the weight behind them, because if someone had rerouted that container and sealed it and left it without documentation, then this wasn't just neglect, it was deliberate And if it was deliberate, then Harbor might have been left for dead, which raised the most important question of all. Why? Tom did something then that he hadn't done in years, something that pulled him out of the present. And back into the man he used to be, he made a call to his brother Nate, a retired state trooper who had spent the last decade helping out with missing person cases. And after explaining the situation, the dog, the container, and the rerouted manifest, Nate went silent for a moment before asking, "What did the tag say again?" And when Tom repeated the numbers, Nate cursed softly under his breath, because a case had passed through his desk a few months earlier, one that hadn't. Sat right with him, a small-town report about a single mother, veterinary assistant named Lauren Meyer, who had vanished without warning. Last seen leaving her job at a private animal shelter in Tally Ridge with her dog, a German Shepherd, in the passenger seat, and who never made it home. Her car found a day later abandoned near a rail yard, the back seat covered in dog hair. But no dog and no Lauren, and the only thing recovered from the scene was a collar tag, bent, scorched, and half buried in the gravel with one word still legible beneath the soot: Harbor. And suddenly, everything connected. The dog from the container wasn't just a survivor. He was a witness, a carrier of truth, four-legged memory. And if he had survived 17 days in a steel box, it was because he was trying to come back. Not for himself, but for her. For Lauren. The woman who had raised him, trained him, trusted him, and maybe in those final moments handed him something to protect. Something still sealed in silence. The rest of this story, the contents of her last journal, the camera, memory card found hidden in Harbor's makeshift blanket, the moment Harbor returned to the spot where it all began. All of that is still to come. But for now, what matters most is this: a dog who refused to give up, even when the door closed. Even when the light disappeared, even when the air thinned and the heat climbed. Because somewhere in the depth of instinct and loyalty, Harbor knew she was still out there. And that if he just held on long enough, someone would hear him. Someone would find him. Maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. They say dogs remember everything, not just smells and sounds, but feelings, routines, even people who disappear without saying goodbye. And as Harbor lay curled in the quiet corner of the recovery room, his four dripped steady, his breathing finally. Even there was a stillness about him that no one could quite explain. Not the vet techs, not the behavioral team who had been brought in to assess trauma, not even Dr. Emily Carver, who had worked cases like his before, and yet had never seen a dog respond with such focused stillness, because Harbor wasn't trembling. He wasn't shutting down. He wasn't reacting with fear. He was watching, waiting. And every time someone passed by the glass door of the recovery room, he lifted his head slightly, sniffed the air.
Ow.
Then rested it back on his paws, as if checking whether a certain scent had returned, a scent he hadn't forgotten, not through the sealed weeks inside that container, not through the unbearable thirst or the hunger that had shrunk his frame to nearly half its weight. Because somewhere buried in that unwavering canine memory was Lauren, her voice, her scent, her last command, and maybe even her last hope. And when Tom Hale visited him that morning with a laminated photo of Harbor as a pup, a grainy scan from a missing person flyer that had been mailed to his brother Nate's precinct, the dog sat up for the first time without assistance, his ears rising just slightly, his nose quivering. And when Tom crouched beside him and whispered, "You knew her, didn't you?" the dog closed his eyes, leaned his head forward, and pressed it gently against Tom's knee. Not out of pain or confusion, but with purpose, like he was confirming something, and in that moment, Tom felt it in his chest. This wasn't over, not even close. Nate arrived that same afternoon with a folder of photocopied case files, a USB drive filled with Lauren's last known cell phone data, and a leather notebook from the original investigators. All of it tucked into a worn canvas bag that smelled faintly of coffee and dust. And when he sat across from Tom in the break room of the port's operations building, he laid it out like a puzzle, piece by piece, page by page. And together, they began mapping something that hadn't made sense a year ago, but now, through Harbor's reappearance, began to form an outline, like a faint constellation finally coming into focus. Lauren Meyer had been quiet by most accounts, soft-spoken, deeply involved in animal rescue, known for taking in strays and for avoiding large crowds. The kind of woman who carried dog biscuits in her coat pocket and always left her porch light on, just in case, she'd say, laughing, even though no one quite knew what she meant, and on the day she disappeared. July 12, 2024, she had clocked out early from her job at Paws and Pines, a privately funded animal sanctuary just outside of Tally Ridge. Taken a detour on her usual drive home, and had left one final voicemail on her sister's phone, saying, "I think I found something strange in the shipping yard. I'm going to check it out quickly, tell you later," but she never did. And her phone had pinged one last time before shutting off completely. No confirmed sightings, no fingerprints. No signs of a struggle, just a parked car and a missing woman. And now, over a year later, Harbor, her registered emotional support dog, had somehow crossed the state, survived 17 days in a steel box, and reappeared in a port 240 miles away, guarding something they still didn't fully understand. And as Nate flipped through Lauren's last known journal entries, recovered from her home by the county search team, one particular page stood out, the handwriting shakier than usual, a short line written and then underlined twice. "If anything happens to me, Harbor knows the way." It didn't make sense then, but now it sent chills down their spines, because Lauren hadn't just vanished, she had prepared for it. She maybe even predicted it. And she had trusted her dog to carry something back, to lead someone forward. And Tom leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the ceiling like he was looking for a sign, then stood abruptly, grabbed his car keys, and simply said, "I want to see where she lived." The drive to Tally Ridge took 3 hours, winding through back roads, pine groves, and fading roadside signs that hadn't been replaced in years. And as they approached the edge of the rural town, Nate turned off the main road and into a gravel path framed by wild grass, the kind of path you'd only find if you knew where to look. And eventually, it pulled into a clearing with a modest wooden house, pale yellow siding, a wraparound porch, wind chimes rusted by the seasons. And it looked like the kind of place where someone still lived, except no one had in over a year, not since Lauren vanished. The property had been maintained by her sister ever since, grass trimmed, mailbox cleared, but otherwise left untouched. And as Tom stepped onto the porch and looked out at the woods beyond, something about the air felt different, quieter, like the kind of quiet that remembers everything. And when they opened the front door with the key provided by the sheriff's office, the house smelled of cedar and dog shampoo, faint but unmistakable. And inside, on a table in the living room, was a framed photo of Lauren and Harbor, taken just 6 weeks before she vanished, the dog still growing into his legs, his eyes already wise beyond his months. And in the background, a row of storage containers, oddly familiar, haunting even, stacked along a fence line behind the sanctuary where she worked. They searched the house gently, respectfully, noting the things she had left behind: a vet's uniform still folded on the couch, a training clicker beside the TV remote, an open notebook with a list of future dog names, and it all felt like someone had simply gone out for groceries and never returned. Till Nate opened a drawer in the kitchen labeled emergency, and inside found a small flash drive, labeled only with one word: Harbor. They brought it back to the car in silence, plugged it into Tom's laptop, and waited. On it were a series of files, mostly scanned documents, adoption papers, a few notes. But the final file, marked Last Walk, was a video, 2 minutes long, slightly shaky, showing Lauren walking Harbor along the fence line of the sanctuary at dusk, the camera facing away from her, probably clipped to her chest. And in the final 10 seconds, she stops, turns toward the containers, and whispers something too soft to hear. And the camera captures Harbor's ears perking up, his body tensing slightly, then shifting in front of her like a shield. And the screen goes black. No context, no follow-up. Just that, a signal that something had happened, something she knew might happen. And she had recorded her last known walk with her dog, not for herself, but maybe for whoever found him, whenever that might be. Now it had happened. Harbor had returned. And the question was no longer what he had survived, but what he had seen, what he had remembered, and what he was still trying to lead them to. Sometimes stories don't move forward, they circle back, retrace their own footsteps, come home through a door that was never closed. And as Tom Hale stood at the edge of the Paws and Pines Animal Sanctuary, boots planted in dry dirt cicadas, humming somewhere above the old shipping containers stacked 3 high beyond the far paddock, he felt that kind of circle, that creeping, undeniable sensation that something unfinished had just arrived full circle. And beside him, tail low but alert, Harbor stood silently, his fur catching the soft orange light of late afternoon, his eyes fixed on the fence like he'd been here 1,000 times before. And in truth, maybe he had, because this was the last place Lauren Meyer had walked with him, the last place anyone had seen her, and though it had been over a year since, her footsteps had vanished. The dog had not forgotten, not the smell of the grass after rain, not the rhythm of her stride, not the distant creak of the gates where the containers ended and the woods began. And when the rescue van parked nearby opened its rear door and Harbor stepped out into the dust, something happened that made everyone go still. He froze for a second, sniffed the wind, then walked, not wandered, not trotted, walked in a perfectly straight line toward the farthest corner of the property, past the old water trough, past the swing Lauren had built for the staff's children, past the shaded memorial tree where former rescues had been buried. And he did not stop until he reached the corner post at the edge of the shipping yard, where chain-link fencing met stacked metal and weeds curled around bolts like vines over forgotten secrets. And there, without looking back, Harbor sat, pressed, his nose to the earth, and began to paw, slow at first, then with a growing urgency that startled the others into motion. Tom shouted for Nate Framey, for the property's caretaker who had reluctantly agreed to let them inside, and everyone came running. Dust rising behind their boots, not knowing what they were about to find, only that the dog, the one, who had waited in silence inside a steel box for 17 days, was finally ready to speak. Harbor's digging revealed something hard within minutes, not bone, not metal, but something stranger, a rectangular object wrapped in black trash, bags and bound with duct tape. And when Nate and Tom cleared the soil with gloved hands, gently peeling back the layers, they uncovered a military-grade waterproof storage case, scratched but intact, and as the latches clicked open beneath Nate's fingers, the group leaned in and held their breath. Inside were 3 things: a handheld voice recorder, a sealed envelope, with "To whoever finds Harbor" written in tight cursive across the front, on a lanyard with a missing access badge marked Private Cargo B-15. The same ID number burned into the side of the container Harbor had been found in. Silence fell, thick and electric, and it was Tom who whispered, "She left this," like a prayer, like an apology, and no one dared touch the envelope until Nate gave a small nod. Tom opened it slowly, careful not to tear the folds, and inside were 5 pages, handwritten, water-stained but legible. What they contained wasn't just a goodbye, it was a breadcrumb trail, testimony, a timeline of everything Lauren had discovered in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. And it painted a picture of a woman who had uncovered something she was never supposed to see. That a private freight company subcontracting with the port had been rerouting unclaimed containers from smaller yards, hiding them in blind manifests, and in at least 2 cases had allegedly used the containers for illegal animal storage, a black market trade that Lauren had accidentally uncovered while volunteering to transport dogs rescued from out-of-state shelters. And when she tried to report it, no one listened, except Harbor, who had been with her the night she intercepted a shipment near Yard B, the same container yard where her car was found, and the same yard where she and Harbor were last tracked. She wrote about being followed, about finding scratches on her truck door that didn't match any animals she'd worked with, about a night when Harbor stood at the door growling long after midnight, and about her plan if anything happened. To her to leave clues only Harbor would understand, a trail of scent, of memory, of instinct. She never expected him to survive, as she hoped. Tom read the letter twice, then placed it back into the case like it was something holy, and turned to Harbor, who sat watching, chest rising steady, eyes soft but unmoving, like he knew every Word like he had carried them folded inside his heart the whole time. And Nate picked up the recorder, pressed play. And a static-filled voice crackled into life. Lauren's voice. Quiet, focused, a little rushed, saying, "If you're hearing, this Harbor made it. It means he survived. That means I didn't. I don't know who you are, but if you care enough to listen, please don't let this disappear. Harbor deserves more than silence. He's not just a dog, he's my witness. He's the one who never left." And then it ended. No farewell. Just that her final plea. And in the stillness that followed, not even the wind dared to move. As if the world was holding its breath for a woman no one remembered except a dog who refused to forget. The following week, Harbor was officially transferred into Tom Hale's care under a special state witness protection clause for animals involved in active investigations. A rarely used legal code, but one Nate insisted upon. And while the case against the freight company would take months, maybe years to reach conclusion, the container yard was sealed, audited, and emptied. And behind the scenes, Harbor's story began to spread, not as a viral headline, but as something quieter, deeper, a whispered legend among rescue groups, police canine units, and veterinary forums. A story passed between people who understood what it meant to fight for a voice that couldn't speak. And every time someone heard it, something changed in them. Harbor became more than a survivor. He became a reminder that dogs don't just love, they remember, they wait, they protect, even when no one's watching. And Tom, once just a supervisor at the docks, became something else too, a keeper of someone's last hope, a man who had lived his life moving containers without ever wondering what was inside, till one day he opened one and found the beating heart of a story that refused to die. And still, in the quiet hours of early morning, when the sun is barely climbing, and the Harbor cranes are silhouetted against the fog, you can find Harbor sitting on the porch of Tom's cottage, staring east, toward the horizon, not restless, not sad, just watching. Like he's still waiting for someone he already knows isn't coming home, but maybe, just maybe, might find her way into the wind one day, and until then, he'll be there. Exactly where she told him to be, at the edge of the world, holding on. It began with a single photo, Harbor sitting beside the open shipping container. Sun on his fur, eyes distant, ribs visible, a silver bowl at his feet. And Tom Hale crouched beside him with one hand, gently resting between the shepherds. Shoulders, not staged, not planned, just a moment caught on someone's phone before the vet van pulled away. And when that photo was posted to a small rescue group's Facebook page in Charleston, it was meant only as a record, a memory, maybe something to look back on later and remember what they'd all witnessed. But what no one expected was that, within 12 hours, the photo had been shared over 500 times. By the end of the second day, it had crossed 1 million views. Translated captions in Portuguese, Japanese, Hindi, German, hundreds of thousands of comments flooding in, some asking if Harbor was up for adoption, others simply sharing their own stories. This reminds me of my dog Max, who waited at the train station after my dad passed. Or how did this dog survive this long? It must have been love, or I'm crying in my kitchen at 2:30. And where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? And replies came from every corner of the globe, from California to Cairo, from farmers in Kansas to soldiers stationed overseas. And slowly, Harbor's story became something bigger than anyone could contain, not just about survival, but about loyalty, intuition, the way dogs hold on when the rest of the world lets go. And soon, national news outlets picked it up, labeling Harbor as the miracle dog of the port. Though anyone who had met him face to face would tell you it wasn't a miracle, it was intention. A quiet, determined refusal to let Lauren's story disappear. The freight company involved was eventually taken down, not through scandalous headlines or dramatic arrests, but through quiet legal proceedings led by Nate and a network of investigators who never stopped pushing and when. Court records finally showed that 3 additional containers had been illegally rerouted and sealed. With unauthorized animal transport inside, it confirmed everything Lauren had feared and everything she had tried to expose. And though her body was never found, the journal, the recording, and Harbor's actions served as admissible testimony in court, a legal first that set precedent. A dog's behavior used not just as evidence of trauma, but as direct, intentional communication of location, loyalty, and response. And when Tom stood before a judge to describe Harbor's digging at the fence line, his unwavering return to the burial site, his physical distress when standing near the storage yard where Lauren's car had been found, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. One juror later said, "I've seen people lie. But that dog, he told the truth in a way no human ever could." And that truth changed everything. In the weeks that followed, Tom and Harbor settled into a new rhythm, not a return to normal, but a different kind of quiet morning walks that traced the shoreline near the port, evenings on the porch with music playing low, and an old blanket folded neatly in Harbor's bed, the same one that had been found in the container cleaned. Now, stitched at the edges by a local volunteer, embroidered with Lauren's initials as a way of giving back something that couldn't be lost. And every so often, when Tom would say her name aloud, Lauren Harbor would raise his head, ears tilted forward, eyes soft like a candle, flickering at the sound of a prayer, not in sadness, but in memory, because for Harbor, she never really left. She just became the space between moments, stillness before sunrise, the scent that lingers in autumn air when the wind shifts just slightly west. A documentary was made small, independent, narrated softly with the real audio from Lauren's recorder layered over slow shots of the port, the house, the sanctuary, and of Harbor walking the same fence line with Tom one last time. And when it premiered online, donations poured in from people who had never heard of Tally Ridge, people who had never owned a dog, people who didn't believe in anything spiritual until they saw Harbor press his nose to the earth and refuse to move. And every cent of that money went into founding Lauren's Law, a rescue initiative that funded emergency GPS callers, legal support for animal whistleblowers, and better checks on container cargo, manifests in 4 U.S. ports, and on. The first anniversary of Harbor's rescue, a plaque was placed at the edge of the sanctuary, beside the memorial tree, etched with 4 simple words. She trusted him. He delivered. And still, the world didn't forget. Teachers used Harbor's story in classrooms to teach empathy. Therapists shared it with clients to talk about grief and resilience. Veterans groups sent handwritten letters to Tom thanking him for giving Harbor a home. And every once in a while, someone would show up at the port asking quietly if Harbor was still around, was hoping to see him in person. The dog who waited, who endured, who returned with more than anyone thought possible. And always Tom would smile, gesture to the porch or the open path near the dock's edge, and say, "He's around. If you're quiet, he'll find you." And perhaps that's the most important part of this story, not the rescue, not the viral posts or the legal outcome, but the reminder that sometimes, when the world is loud with things that don't matter, there are silent heroes walking among us, sleeping beside our beds, waiting by the door, carrying more than we ever realize. And that when everything else disappears, the noise, the headlines, the chaos, a dog will still choose you, even in the dark, even when the door is sealed, even when the odds are impossible. So tonight, wherever you are, whether it's 9 p.m. in Ohio or 3 a.m. in New Delhi, take a moment to look at your dog, or think of the one you lost and ask yourself, if you were trapped, if the world forgot your name, if the silence felt too heavy, would they wait for you? And more importantly, would you wait for them? Let us know in the comments, what's your dog's name and where are you watching from? Because these stories, they don't belong to us. They belong to every beating heart that's ever loved. A 4-legged soul who never needed words to say, "I'm here and I'm not leaving."